The laughter reached Honoria before the words did, bright and crystalline, and utterly without mercy. She had been standing near the edge of the Blackmoor Ballroom for nearly an hour, half hidden behind a towering arrangement of white roses and trailing ivy. The flowers smelled of summer gardens and expensive perfume. She had been watching the dancers, imagining what it might feel like to be among them, when Venetia's voice cut through her reverie. Honestly, Mother, why did we even bring her? Honoria's spine stiffened. She didn't turn around. She had learned, over 7 seasons of such moments, that turning around only made it worse. Look at her, standing there like a wilted flower someone forgot to throw away. Venetia's voice carried across the alcove with practiced carelessness, pitched just loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. A fan snapped open somewhere behind Honoria. Someone giggled. No one will choose you, Honoria. Not tonight. Not ever. The words landed like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of whispered amusement through the clusters of silk-clad ladies nearby. Honoria felt each ripple as a physical thing, heat climbing her neck, her cheeks, settling behind her eyes where tears threatened, but would not be permitted to fall. Her gown was last season's pale blue, hastily altered by her own hands to hide the worn seams. The pearls at her throat were paste. In the gilt-framed mirror across the room, she could see Venetia holding court in champagne silk that cost more than their household spent on food in 3 months. Their mother stood beside her, saying nothing, her silence its own kind of agreement. Perhaps she'll catch the eye of some elderly widower, one of Venetia's friends suggested, her voice carrying that particular tone of false sympathy that was worse than outright cruelty. Someone half-blind with gout who won't notice she has no conversation. Or no dowry, another added, or no figure to speak of. Or no, ladies, please. Venetia's laugh tinkled like breaking crystal. You'll make her cry, and then we'll have to pretend to comfort her, and I simply cannot bear the tedium. More laughter, delicate and devastating. Honoria's hands trembled where they clutched her fan, a painted thing depicting shepherdesses that had belonged to her grandmother. She should leave. She should find a quiet corner, a retiring room, anywhere but here, where her humiliation was becoming the evening's entertainment. But her feet wouldn't move. 7 seasons she had endured this. 7 years of standing in Venetia's shadow, while suitor after suitor looked through her as though she were made of glass. She had learned to make herself small, invisible, forgettable. It was easier that way. Safer. Except tonight, something inside her had cracked. Perhaps it was the way Venetia had accidentally spilled tea on Honoria's original gown that morning. Perhaps it was the way their mother had sighed and said, "Well, no one will be looking at you anyway." Perhaps it was simply that 7 years of small cuts had finally drawn too much blood. Honoria lifted her chin. If she was going to be humiliated, she would at least face it standing straight. Her grandmother had always said that dignity cost nothing, and it was the one thing no one could take from you unless you surrendered it yourself. Gracious, she's actually crying, Venetia announced to her circle, though Honoria's eyes were perfectly dry. Someone fetch her a handkerchief before she makes a scene, though I suppose even a scene would be more attention than she usually receives. The cruelty was so casual, so practiced, that it barely registered anymore. Honoria had heard variations of these words for years. She had built calluses over the wounds they left, scar tissue that protected her from the worst of the pain. But tonight, standing alone in her faded blue gown, while the candlelight caught the champagne silk of her sister's dress like captured starlight, she felt those calluses crack. I believe the only scene being made, a male voice cut through the chatter like a blade through silk, is by those who mistake cruelty for wit. The entire alcove went silent. Honoria turned, along with everyone else, toward the source of that voice. A man was approaching through the crowd, which parted for him like the Red Sea before Moses. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair swept back from a face of sharp angles and aristocratic bone structure. His evening clothes were immaculate, his bearing almost military in its precision, and his storm-colored eyes held an expression that made Venetia's smile falter for the first time all evening. Honoria had never seen him before. She would have remembered. "Your Grace," Lady Ashford breathed, dropping into a curtsy so deep it bordered on theatrical. "What an honor. We had heard you'd returned to London, but we hardly dared hope." "Your Grace." The words echoed in Honoria's mind like bells. This was a duke who had just publicly chastised her sister, Lady Ashford. He acknowledged her mother with the barest nod, his gaze sweeping past Venetia entirely, a dismissal so complete it was almost physical, before landing on Honoria with an intensity that made her breath catch. "And you must be the wilted flower." She should have been mortified. Instead, something reckless sparked in her chest, kindled by years of swallowed words and suppressed fury. "I prefer to think of myself as a late bloomer, Your Grace," she heard herself say. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "We're hardier than the showier varieties. We survive frosts that would kill a hothouse rose." Behind her, she heard Venetia's sharp intake of breath. Beside her, she felt her mother's horrified stare burning into her profile. But the Duke, whoever he was, smiled. It was a small thing, barely a curve of his lips, but it transformed his face from coldly handsome to something far more dangerous. "Do you dance, miss?" "Honoria Ashford," she supplied, hardly believing this was happening. The candles seemed brighter suddenly, the music sweeter, the air thick with possibility and peril. "Miss Honoria Ashford," he extended his hand. "Do you dance?" The ballroom had gone quiet around them. Honoria could feel hundreds of eyes turning their direction, could see the shocked faces of the matrons, the calculating expressions of the young ladies. She could feel Venetia's fury like heat from a fire. And he was asking her, the invisible sister, the wilted flower. She placed her hand in his. "I do, Your Grace." His fingers closed around hers, warm and firm through their gloves, and he led her toward the center of the floor, where couples were assembling for a waltz. The crowd parted again, murmuring like wind through autumn leaves, and Honoria caught glimpses of their faces. Confusion, jealousy, fascination, outrage. She saw Venetia, her lovely face twisted with something that looked very much like fury. "Good," whispered a voice inside her that she barely recognized. "Let her see what it feels like." "You're wondering why," the Duke said as he drew her into position, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers at shoulder height. His touch was correct, proper, but there was nothing cold about it. She could feel the warmth of his palm through the silk of her gown. Among other things, such as your name, for one. It seems poor etiquette to waltz with a man whose title I know, but whose identity remains a mystery. The music began, a sweeping melody that seemed to lift her off her feet, even before they started moving. He led her into the first steps, with an ease that suggested he'd been dancing since before he could walk. "Leander Ashworth," he said, "Duke of Valemont." Honoria nearly stumbled. Valemont. Even she, cloistered as she was from the worst of society gossip, knew that name. The Duke of Valemont, who had disappeared from society 3 years ago after some scandal involving a broken engagement. The Duke of Valemont, whose family was among the oldest and wealthiest in England. The Duke of Valemont, who was reportedly as cold as winter and twice as unforgiving. He didn't feel cold now. His hand was warm against her waist, his grip on her finger steady and sure. "Your reputation precedes you," she managed. "As does yours." She blinked. "I wasn't aware I had a reputation." "Precisely." His storm-colored eyes held hers as he guided her through a turn, the ballroom spinning around them in a blur of candlelight and silk. 7 seasons, Miss Ashford. 7 years of attending every ball, every dinner, every garden party, and yet you remain conspicuously unmarried. Either you are remarkably unfortunate, or you have been deliberately hiding. Her pulse quickened, though whether from the dancing or his words, she couldn't tell. Perhaps I simply haven't met anyone worth marrying. Perhaps. Something flickered in his expression, interest, or calculation, or both. Or perhaps you've been so busy surviving frosts that you forgot flowers are meant to bloom. The music swelled around them, and for a moment, Honoria forgot about the watching crowd, about Venetia's fury, about the impossibility of this entire situation. She forgot everything except the warmth of his hand, the intensity of his gaze, and the terrifying possibility that she was about to wake up and discover this was all a dream. "Why me?" she asked finally, as the waltz began to wind toward its conclusion. "You could have danced with anyone." "I could have," he agreed, "but they would have bored me within seconds. You, Miss Ashford, are the first woman in 3 years to say something interesting at a ball. I called myself a wilted flower. You called yourself a survivor." The music ended, but he didn't immediately release her. Around them, couples bowed and curtsied, but they remained frozen in the center of the floor, an island of stillness in a sea of movement. "I find myself in need of someone who knows how to survive, Miss Ashford. Someone intelligent enough to navigate difficult situations, and invisible enough to have escaped the usual society entanglements." The crowd around them was murmuring, pressing closer, eager to discover what had transpired between them. Honoria saw her mother approaching with determined steps, saw Venetia pushing through the crowd with a fixed smile that didn't reach her eyes. "What exactly are you proposing, Your Grace?" "Not here." His hand tightened on hers briefly before releasing. "Tomorrow. Call at Ashworth House at 2 o'clock. Tell your mother you're visiting my sister, Lady Clemency. It's true enough." "And if I refuse?" Something flickered in his silver gaze. Surprise, perhaps, or amusement. "Then you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what might have changed, and I suspect you already have enough of those regrets, Miss Ashford." Before she could respond, Venetia arrived at her elbow, all smiles and sweetness now that a duke was watching. "Your Grace, how delightful. My sister didn't mention she was acquainted with you. Honoria, darling, you must introduce us properly." "I'm afraid we've only just met," Leander said, his voice cool as a winter stream. "And I've already taken too much of your sister's time." He bowed to Honoria, a gesture so formal and correct that it somehow felt more intimate than the waltz itself. "Tomorrow, Miss Ashford. 2 o'clock. Don't disappoint me." He turned and walked away, the crowd parting for him once more, leaving Honoria standing in the center of the ballroom with her sister's hand clamped on her arm like a vice. "What?" Venetia hissed through her smile, her nails digging into Honoria's flesh through the thin fabric of her sleeve. "Was that?" Honoria looked at her sister, at the fury burning beneath the perfect composure, and felt something strange and exhilarating bloom in her chest. It felt like power. It felt like possibility. It felt like the first green shoot pushing through frozen ground after a long, bitter winter. "I believe," she said quietly, "it was an invitation." And for the first time in 7 years, she had absolutely no intention of being invisible. Ashworth House loomed before her like a stone giant, its Georgian facade stretching across half the street, its windows glittering in the afternoon sun. Honoria stood on the pavement, clutching her reticule with trembling fingers, wondering if she'd lost her mind entirely. The journey here had been a battle. Her mother had interrogated her for an hour after the ball, desperate to understand how her invisible daughter had captured a duke's attention. Venetia had alternated between sweet concern and sharp-edged questions. At breakfast, she had accidentally stepped on the hem of Honoria's only decent morning dress, tearing it badly. In the end, Honoria had simply repeated what the Duke had told her to say. She was calling on Lady Clemency at her ladyship's invitation. It was a lie wrapped around a truth, and it had tasted strange on her tongue. Now, standing before the house's imposing entrance, she half hoped the butler would turn her away. She could return home, resume her invisible life, and forget this brief glimpse of something different. She could pretend the Duke had never crossed that ballroom, never looked at her, like she was something worth seeing. The door opened before she could knock. Miss Ashford. A severe-looking butler in immaculate livery regarded her with an expression that revealed nothing. His face might have been carved from the same stone as the house itself. His Grace is expecting you. This way, please. His Grace, not her ladyship. So much for visiting the sister. Honoria followed the butler through an entrance hall that could have swallowed her family's entire house. Marble floors gleamed beneath her worn half-boots. Portraits of stern-faced Ashworth ancestors watched her passage with painted disapproval. A grand staircase swept upward toward unseen heights. She smelled beeswax and fresh flowers, old wood and older money. She felt like an imposter, a fraud, a wilted flower indeed, pretending to belong among hothouse orchids. The butler led her not to a formal receiving room, but to a library at the rear of the house. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling, their leather spines creating a tapestry of burgundies and browns and deep forest greens. A fire crackled in the hearth despite the mild weather. Two leather chairs sat before the fire like old friends in conversation. Leander Ashworth stood by the window, afternoon sunlight catching the sharp angles of his face. He wore no jacket, just a waistcoat of deep blue over his shirt sleeves, and the informality made Honoria's pulse stutter. "You came," he said without turning. "You sound surprised." "I sound relieved. There's a difference." He turned then, and gestured to one of the leather chairs. "Please, sit. We have much to discuss, and I prefer not to do so while you're standing there, looking like you expect the floor to swallow you." She sat, perching on the edge of the chair because sinking into its depths felt too comfortable, too familiar. He took the chair across from her, leaning back with a casualness that seemed almost studied, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Before I explain," he said, "I need to know something. Are you desperate?" The question was so blunt it startled a laugh from her. "Desperate for what?" "Marriage, security, escape from your family." His storm-colored eyes were steady on hers, missing nothing. "I watched you last night, Miss Ashford. I watched your sister humiliate you in front of half the ton, watched your mother do nothing to stop it. That kind of cruelty doesn't arise overnight. It grows over years, nurtured by indifference, and repeated without consequence." Heat climbed her cheeks. "You presume much, Your Grace." "I observe much. There's a difference." He echoed her earlier words with a ghost of a smile. "Answer my question. Are you desperate?" Honoria considered lying, considered deflecting with wit or evasion, the way she had learned to protect herself from Venetia's barbs over years of practice. But something in his gaze told her that lies would not serve here. He would see through them. He would dismiss her for trying. "Yes," she said quietly. "I am desperate to be seen, to be valued, to build a life where my worth is not measured against my sister's beauty or my family's expectations. Is that what you wish to hear?" "It's what I needed to know." He leaned forward, forearms braced on his knees. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Ashford, one that requires honesty between us, so let me offer mine in return." He paused, and she saw something flicker behind his careful composure. Pain, perhaps, or the memory of it. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. 3 years ago, I was engaged to Lady Marguerite Thornwell. It was considered the match of the season. A week before the wedding, I discovered that she had been conducting an affair with my closest friend for the better part of a year. They had been laughing at me together, making plans, waiting for me to conveniently die so they could inherit my fortune without the scandal. Honoria's chest tightened. "I'm sorry. Don't be. She did me a favor, though it took years to see it. His laugh was bitter. But my sister and grandmother have decided that 3 years of mourning is quite enough. They've launched a campaign to see me married, and their current favorite is Lady Isolde Pemberton. Wealthy, beautiful, perfectly bred, and utterly insufferable. And you want me to help you avoid this marriage? I want you to help me delay it. My grandmother won't relent unless she believes I am already pursuing someone else. Someone serious enough to warrant her attention, but unknown enough to the ton that, when the arrangement ends, you can slip back into obscurity without scandal attaching to your name. Honoria stared at him. You're asking me to pretend to be courted by you. I'm asking you to pretend to be interesting enough that I would court you. The nuance matters. He rose, moving to a side table where a crystal decanter glittered in the firelight. In exchange, I am offering you something you cannot find elsewhere. A season as my grandmother's guest, access to the highest circles of society, introductions that could secure you a position as a companion or governess in any great house in England when this ends. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid and returned, offering her one. The crystal was cool against her fingers, heavy with quality, and most importantly, his eyes held hers. Freedom from your sister's shadow for 3 full months. Freedom to be seen. Freedom to matter. She took the glass but didn't drink. Why me? Truly. You could have chosen any wallflower at that ball. I told you. You said something interesting. I called myself You called yourself a survivor. He sat again, swirling his own glass but not drinking either. I watched you take your sister's cruelty without flinching. I watched you stand alone while everyone laughed, and I watched you refuse to crumble. And when I approached, you didn't simper or flutter or fall over yourself to please me. You met my eyes and matched my wit. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Rare enough to be worth this elaborate arrangement? Rare enough that I believe you can do what I need. He set down his glass. There will be rules, expectations. My grandmother will scrutinize you relentlessly. Society will wonder and whisper. Your family will likely be furious. But if you can survive 3 months in my world, Miss Ashford, you will leave it with every tool you need to build a different life. Honoria looked at the glass in her hand, at the fire dancing in its amber depths like trapped sunlight. 3 months. 3 months of freedom, of visibility, of being treated as though she mattered. And at the end, references that could open doors she'd never even known existed. I have conditions, she said. His eyebrow rose. You're negotiating with a duke. I'm negotiating with a man who needs my help as much as I need his. She set down her own glass with a decisive click. First, my mother must be told I am serving as companion to your grandmother. Nothing about courtship or arrangement. I won't give Venetia ammunition to use against me when this ends. Agreed. Second, when this ends, I want letters of introduction. Not from you, but from your grandmother, and any connections she can provide. I need to be able to support myself honestly. My grandmother will likely insist on it herself. She has strong opinions about women having options. Third, Honoria met his eyes squarely. If you decide to actually pursue someone, whether Lady Isolde or anyone else, this ends immediately. I won't be used as a shield while you conduct a real courtship elsewhere. I may be invisible, Your Grace, but I am not a fool, and I won't be made to look like one. Something shifted in his expression, respect, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. You have my word, he said. All 3 conditions. Do we have an agreement? He extended his hand across the space between them. Honoria looked at it, elegant and strong, a signet ring gleaming on his smallest finger, entirely foreign to her careful, constrained world. She thought of 7 seasons standing in corners, of 7 years of Venetia's cruelty and her mother's indifference, of the life waiting for her at home, growing smaller and darker with each passing year, like a room with the windows slowly being bricked shut. She took his hand. "We have an agreement." His grip was warm and firm, and something in the air seemed to change. An invisible door opening, a threshold crossed that could not be uncrossed. "Then welcome to Ashworth House, Miss Ashford." His smile was sharp and strangely gentle all at once. "I do hope you're ready for what comes next." Before she could ask what he meant, the library door burst open with enough force to rattle the books on their shelves. "Leander, Grandmother says you've hidden a mystery woman in here, and I simply had to see for myself." "Oh." A young woman stood in the doorway, perhaps 19 or 20, with the same dark hair as Leander, but warm brown eyes that sparkled with irrepressible curiosity. She had her brother's aristocratic bone structure, but where his face was sharp and guarded, hers was open and animated. She was dressed in a muslin day dress of cheerful yellow, and she looked at Honoria with the delighted expression of someone who had just discovered an unexpected gift on an ordinary Tuesday. "You must be her," she breathed. "The one who called herself a wilted flower. That's absolutely brilliant." Leander told me, and I made him repeat it 3 times, because I couldn't believe anyone had actually said something that clever to his face. "I'm Clemency, his sister. He's being dreadfully serious, isn't he? He always is. But don't worry, I'm wonderful fun, and I've already decided we're going to be the best of friends. Do you like novels? I have hundreds. Do you play the pianoforte? I'm terrible at it, but I love listening. Do you—" "Clemency." Leander's voice carried a familiar weariness that spoke of years of such interruptions. "Don't Clemency me in that tone. You've been miserable for 3 years, and now you've finally done something interesting, and I refuse to let you ruin it by being all cold and ducal about everything." She swept across the room and grabbed both of Honoria's hands, squeezing them warmly. Her fingers were soft, and her grip was enthusiastic. "This is going to be marvelous. Trust me. I have a feeling about these things, and my feelings are almost never wrong. Well, sometimes they're wrong, but not about important things. And this is important." Looking at her beaming face, at Leander's resigned expression that couldn't quite hide his affection, at the beautiful library full of books and firelight and impossible possibilities, Honoria found herself almost believing it. Almost. The Dowager Duchess of Valemont did not receive visitors in the drawing room like ordinary hostesses. She held court in a private solar on the 2nd floor, decorated in shades of silver and ice blue that matched the winter in her eyes. She sat in a high-backed chair before tall windows, her posture carved from marble, her silver hair swept back in an elaborate arrangement. She wore black for mourning. Her son had died 2 years ago, but made it look regal rather than somber. Jet beads glittered at her throat. She was, Honoria thought, exactly as terrifying as a Dowager Duchess ought to be. "So," the Dowager said, her voice crisp and cutting as a winter wind, "this is the young woman who set the Blackmore Ballroom ablaze with gossip." Honoria curtsied, grateful for the years of practice her mother had drilled into her, despite everything else. "Your Grace, I'm honored by the invitation to call upon you." "Honored." The Dowager's thin lips quirked. A pretty word. "Sit down, Miss Ashford. Let us dispense with pretty words and speak plainly." There was a chair positioned before her, clearly placed for exactly this purpose. An audience chair, designed to make the occupant feel small and scrutinized. Honoria sat, folding her hands in her lap and meeting the older woman's gaze directly. She had spent her whole life being found wanting. She would not cower now. "My grandson tells me you've agreed to an arrangement." The Dowager's pale eyes swept over her, missing nothing. Not the careful mending on her gloves, not the unfashionable cut of her dress, not the paste pearls at her throat, not the way Honoria's chin lifted slightly under scrutiny. "He believes you can help him avoid Lady Isolde Pemberton." Yes, Your Grace. And what do you believe, Miss Ashford? The question was a trap. Honoria could see it in the sharpness of the dowager's gaze, the careful stillness of her posture. This woman had navigated society's treacherous waters for 6 decades. She had buried a husband and a son. She had watched her grandson's heart broken by a scheming woman. She would spot a lie before it fully formed. I believe, Honoria said slowly, choosing each word with care, that your grandson needs someone who will not bore him. And I believe that I need an opportunity to prove I am more than my family has allowed me to be. Whether this arrangement serves both purposes remains to be seen. Silence stretched between them, sharp as a blade. Then the dowager laughed. It was not a warm sound, but it was genuine, and it transformed her severe face into something almost approachable. For a moment, Honoria glimpsed the young woman she must have been once. Beautiful, formidable, and capable of commanding any room she entered. You have spine, she declared. Foolish spine, perhaps, but spine nonetheless. My grandson mentioned you were direct. He failed to mention you were bold. I have been invisible for 7 years, Your Grace. I find I have very little left to lose by speaking plainly. The dowager's eyes narrowed thoughtfully, reassessing. Tell me about your family, Miss Ashford, and do not attempt to paint them favorably. I've already made inquiries, and I know the general shape of things. I want to know how it feels from the inside. Honoria's hands tightened in her lap. She had expected scrutiny, expected questions about her education and accomplishments and prospects. She had not expected this, an invitation to expose the wounds she had spent years learning to hide. But there was something in the dowager's gaze that suggested she would know if Honoria held back. And perhaps more importantly, there was something that suggested she might actually understand. My mother, Honoria began, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest, made a choice long ago to invest everything in my sister. Venetia was beautiful from birth, charming by 3, accomplished by 10. I was always smaller, quieter, and plainer. Rather than divide her attention, my mother simply decided that one daughter would be her triumph and one would be her disappointment. And your father? Dead these 8 years. He was kind to me in his way. He used to read to me in the evenings, poetry mostly. He said I had a mind worth cultivating, even if I lacked Venetia's other gifts. She smiled sadly. But he was also absent more often than not, consumed by business affairs that ultimately came to nothing. When he died, he left debts that consumed most of what we had. My mother has spent every year since trying to marry Venetia to someone wealthy enough to restore our fortunes. While you were left to rot in corners. The bluntness of it stung, even though it was true. I was left to be useful in other ways, managing the household accounts, handling the correspondence, making sure Venetia's gowns were pressed and her hair was perfect, and her every need attended to before she thought to ask. A servant in your own home. A sister who knew her place. Honoria's voice came out steadier than she expected. I stopped hoping for more a long time ago, Your Grace. I learned to survive instead. The dowager was silent for a long moment, her pale eyes unreadable. My grandson, she said finally, has been surviving for 3 years. Ever since that wretched Thornwell girl broke his heart and his pride in a single blow. Honoria said nothing, sensing that more was coming. He has performed his duties admirably since his father died, managed the estates, attended Parliament, and fulfilled every obligation of his title with precision and competence. But he has not been living, Miss Ashford. He has been going through motions, keeping the world at arm's length, refusing to feel anything that might cut as deeply as her betrayal did. The dowager rose, moving to the window with the elegant economy of a woman who had never rushed in her life. The afternoon light caught the silver of her hair, the jet beads at her throat, I have been pushing Lady Isolde Pemberton, not because I believe she would make him happy, she continued, her back to Honoria, but because I hoped any bride might force him to engage with life again. I was wrong. She would bore him into an early grave, and he would let her, simply to avoid the effort of feeling anything at all. She turned, her gaze sharp as broken glass. You, Miss Ashford, are an unknown variable. You might bore him just as thoroughly as Lady Isolde would, or you might surprise me. Either way, I intend to find out. And if I do bore him, then we will part ways at season's end with references that will serve you well and a mutual agreement to never speak of this arrangement again. The dowager moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the frame. But if you do not bore him, if you somehow manage to make him feel something beyond duty and grief, well, that would be a different conversation entirely. Honoria's chest tightened with unexpected emotion. This was not the warning she had expected. It was something closer to hope, disguised as pragmatism. One more thing. The dowager's voice hardened. If you hurt him, if you manipulate his grief or exploit his vulnerability, I will destroy you. Socially, financially, completely. I do not care how sympathetic your circumstances are. My loyalty is to my family first and always. Do we understand each other? Perfectly, Your Grace. Good. The dowager's expression softened fractionally. Nell will show you to your rooms. The Rose Suite, I think. It has the best morning light, and you look like someone who could use more light in her life. She swept from the room, leaving Honoria alone with her racing thoughts and the unsettling realization that she had just been given both a warning and a benediction. A moment later, a young maid appeared in the doorway, round-faced and kind-eyed, with red hair tucked under a neat cap. Miss Ashford, I'm Nell. I've been assigned as your lady's maid. If you'll follow me, I'll show you to your rooms. She smiled shyly. I've already had tea sent up. I thought you might need it after facing her grace. The kindness was so unexpected that Honoria's throat tightened. That's very thoughtful. Thank you. As she followed Nell up another flight of stairs, she caught a glimpse of Clemency at the end of the corridor, practically bouncing with excitement. She likes you, Clemency called. I can tell. She only threatens to destroy people she respects. Looking at her beaming face, at Nell's gentle smile, at the beautiful rose-papered suite that awaited her, larger than her entire home, filled with afternoon light and fresh flowers, Honoria felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. It felt like belonging. It felt like hope. She was terrified to trust it. The Rose Suite was everything Clemency had promised. Walls papered in soft blush and cream, a four-poster bed draped in silk the color of dawn, a writing desk beneath windows overlooking gardens that stretched toward a distant stone folly. The sheets were softer than anything she had ever felt. She had lain awake most of the night, certain morning would reveal this all to be a dream. But morning came with pale sunlight and Nell's gentle knock at the door. Lady Clemency had it sent up, Nell explained, fastening the tiny buttons at Honoria's back with practiced efficiency. She said you'd need something proper to wear while we wait for your wardrobe to arrive. My wardrobe? Oh yes, miss. Lady Clemency has already sent word to Madame Laurent. You're to have a fitting this afternoon. Nell's eyes sparkled with excitement. They say Madame Laurent only takes the most important clients. The Queen herself wears her designs. Honoria's head spun. Less than 24 hours, and already her life had been reorganized without her input. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of transformation. Madame Laurent was indeed a dragon, a sharp-featured Frenchwoman with steel-gray hair, but her gowns were divine. The emerald silk for smaller events, the midnight blue for the opera, and the ivory with gold embroidery for the Whitmore ball itself. Monsieur Beaumont, the dancing master, was worse than a dragon. He was a tyrant with an imperious mustache. No, 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 he shouted, rapping his cane against the floor. Your feet, they are like potatoes. You must feel the music, not count it. By the end of the first week, she heard non, non, non in her dreams. By the end of the second, something had shifted. She stopped counting steps and started feeling them. Once, just once, Monsieur Beaumont nodded and muttered, "Acceptable." From him, it was practically a standing ovation. The Dowager drilled her on forms of address, precedence, and the intricate web of alliances and enmities that governed society. Who was feuding with whom? Which families had old money versus new? Which matrons must be flattered, and which could be safely ignored? Lady Pemberton will be your greatest obstacle, the Dowager said during one afternoon session, her voice crisp. She has decided that Lady Isolde will be the next Duchess of Valemount, and she does not surrender easily. Expect coldness. Expect insults disguised as compliments. Expect attempts to expose your origins. And how should I respond? With grace. With wit. With the absolute certainty that you belong wherever you choose to stand. The Dowager's lips curved slightly. Your sister taught you how to endure cruelty, Miss Ashford. I will teach you how to wield it. Through it all, Leander remained a ghost. He appeared at dinners, perfectly polite and perfectly distant. He inquired about her comfort and her preparations for upcoming events. He nodded to her when they passed in corridors, but he made no attempt at private conversation, no effort to continue what had begun between them in the library. It was exactly what she should have wanted, the arrangement proceeding precisely as planned, professional and detached. So why did his absence feel like a door closing? He's always like this, Clemency said on the 10th day, catching Honoria's gaze following Leander as he left the breakfast room. Ever since father died, he buries himself in work and emerges only for meals. I think he's afraid that if he stops moving, he'll have to feel things. And feeling things is terrifying when you've lost as much as he has. On the 12th night, Honoria found herself restless. Her feet still ached from Monsieur Beaumont's drilling, and her mind was too full of fashion plates and social calendars, and the Dowager's endless instructions to allow sleep. She wrapped herself in a borrowed shawl and slipped down to the library, hoping to lose herself in books the way she had when she was young. She didn't expect to find Leander there. He sat in one of the leather chairs before the fire, papers spread across a side table, a ledger open in his lap. He looked exhausted, shadows under his eyes, his cravat loosened, his hair disheveled from running his hands through it. He didn't notice her entrance, lost in whatever numbers consumed him. "I can leave," she said softly. He startled, nearly dropping the ledger, and the vulnerability in that moment, the way his carefully constructed mask slipped before he could catch it, made her chest ache with recognition. "Stay." He set aside the ledger with deliberate care. "I was merely drowning in accounts. Company might help me remember there's a world beyond numbers." She settled into the chair across from him, tucking her feet beneath her like a child. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows across his face, softening the sharp angles. "Clemency told me about your father," she said, then immediately regretted it. "I'm sorry. That was presumptuous. You don't have to—" "It's all right." His voice was tired rather than angry. "Everyone knows. It's almost worse when people pretend they don't. At least honesty spares us both the performance." "What was he like?" Leander was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire. "He was brilliant," he said finally. "Demanding. Impossible to please when it came to duty, but underneath all of it he was kind. He used to read to me in this very room when I was young. Shakespeare, mostly. He believed every problem in life could be illuminated by the appropriate quotation." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. He was wrong, of course, but it was comforting to pretend otherwise. "And your mother?" "Died when Clemency was born. I was 4. I barely remember her, which somehow makes it worse. I mourn an absence rather than a presence." He looked at her then, his storm-colored eyes unexpectedly vulnerable. "My father kept her books in here. He used to say they were waiting for someone who would understand them." Honoria thought of her own father, reading poetry to her by candlelight. We both lost pieces of ourselves when we lost them. Yes, the single word held a world of grief. Though my father always said that loss was the price of love, and love was worth any price. His laugh was bitter. I believed him once, before Marguerite taught me that not all love is real, and sometimes the price you pay is for nothing but illusion. They sat in silence, the fire settling into embers between them. Honoria understood suddenly why he had chosen her for this arrangement, not just because she was invisible and convenient, but because she understood survival. She understood what it meant to build walls around a wounded heart. "Thank you," she said finally, "for telling me. You didn't have to." "No, I didn't." He rose, and the distance returned to his bearing, though something in his eyes remained warm. "The Whitmore ball is in 5 days. My grandmother believes you'll be ready. I believe you've been ready all along. You simply needed someone to see it." He left her alone in the library, surrounded by books and firelight, and the lingering weight of his unexpected honesty. Honoria stayed until the fire burned down to ash, thinking about masks and grief and the dangerous territory between arrangement and something more. The days before the Whitmore ball compressed into a blur of final fittings and last-minute preparations. Madame Laurent delivered the gowns herself, each one more beautiful than the last. The emerald silk for a small dinner at the Ashworth townhouse, the midnight blue for the opera, and the ivory with gold embroidery for the ball itself, so exquisite that Honoria was afraid to touch it. "You will be magnificent," Madame Laurent pronounced, surveying her work with satisfaction. "Society will have no choice but to pay attention." That was precisely what worried Honoria. The dinner party was her first test, a gathering of 20 carefully selected guests, designed to introduce her to society's key players in a controlled environment. She wore the emerald silk, and when she descended the stairs, Clemency actually gasped. "You look like a duchess already," she whispered. "Leander is going to forget how to breathe." Leander, as it happened, maintained his breathing perfectly well. He greeted her with formal courtesy, complimented the gown with detached politeness, and spent the evening in conversation with elderly lords about parliamentary matters. But once, just once, Honoria caught him watching her from across the room with an expression she couldn't quite name. When their eyes met, he looked away first. Progress, perhaps, or perhaps nothing at all. The evening passed without disaster. She navigated conversation with practiced grace, deploying the dowager's lessons about which topics were safe and which were minefields. She danced with 3 different gentlemen, none of whom stepped on her feet or commented on her obscure origins. She even survived an introduction to Lady Pemberton, who looked at her like something unpleasant she'd found on her shoe but said nothing overtly cruel. "Well done," the dowager said afterward, the highest praise she had yet offered. "You didn't embarrass anyone. Tomorrow, we begin in earnest." But it was what happened the next morning that changed everything. Honoria was reading in the library. She had claimed it as her own space now, with the dowager's tacit permission, when Leander appeared in the doorway. "I have something for you," he said, without preamble. "I meant to give it to you days ago, but I kept finding reasons to delay." He crossed to where she sat and placed a slim volume in her hands. Dark green leather, worn soft with age, gilt lettering catching the morning light. "It's Ovid," he said. "Metamorphoses. It was my mother's." Honoria's fingers trembled against the leather. "I can't accept this. It belonged to her, which is precisely why I'm giving it to you." He sat in the chair across from her, and his voice gentled in a way she'd never heard before. "My father kept it here after she died, along with her other books. He used to say they were waiting for someone who would understand them. His eyes met hers. "I think you might be that someone." She opened the cover carefully, half afraid it would crumble in her hands. Inside, in faded ink that had once been deep blue, was written, "For every ending, a beginning. For every loss, a becoming. Marianne Ashworth, 1792. Her eyes stung. "She sounds remarkable." She was. Everyone says so. He paused. "I wish I could remember her well enough to know it for myself. Perhaps remembering what she valued is another way of knowing her." Honoria traced the inscription with one finger. "My father used to read me poetry. After he died, I couldn't touch his books for years. They felt like ghosts. But then I realized that reading them was a way of keeping him alive, a way of hearing his voice again, even if only in memory." Something shifted in Leander's expression. Recognition, perhaps, or relief. "My grandmother will tell you that sentiment is weakness," he said quietly. "That grief must be managed, controlled, packed away in boxes where it can't interfere with duty. She's wrong. Grief is just love with nowhere to go. And love is never weakness, even when it hurts." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of shared understanding settling between them like something precious and fragile. "Thank you," Honoria whispered finally. "For this. For trusting me with it. Thank you for being someone worth trusting." He rose, and the formal distance returned to his bearing. But something had changed between them. A door had opened that could not be easily closed. "The Whitmore ball is in 2 days," he said. "Wear the ivory gown. Madame Laurent was right. You'll be unforgettable." He left, and Honoria sat alone with his mother's book pressed against her heart, feeling the first dangerous stirrings of something that had nothing to do with arrangements or performances or survival. It felt like falling. It felt like flying. It felt like transformation. The ivory gown fit like it had been made for her, which of course it had. The silk caught the candlelight and shimmered with each movement, the gold embroidery tracing patterns of leaves and flowers that seemed almost alive. Nell had arranged her dark hair in an intricate style, weaving through it a ribbon that matched the embroidery, and the dowager herself had provided the final touch. Pearls for her ears and throat, luminous and perfect. They were Leander's mother's, the dowager had said, fastening the clasp with surprising gentleness. She would have wanted someone to wear them who understood their worth. Now, standing at the top of the Whitmore grand staircase, Honoria understood why Madame Laurent had called this gown unforgettable. She looked like someone else entirely. Someone who belonged. "Ready?" Leander murmured beside her, devastating in formal evening black, his dark hair swept back to reveal the sharp angles of his face. "Terrified." "Perfect. Terror keeps you sharp." He smiled, and for a moment he looked almost boyish. "Let's give them something to talk about." They descended together, and the ballroom below fell silent. Honoria could feel hundreds of eyes tracking their progress, curious, envious, calculating, hostile. She saw Lady Pemberton's frozen smile, Lady Isolde's barely concealed fury, her own mother's shocked expression across the room. She saw Venetia in rose-pink silk, her lovely face twisted with something ugly. At the bottom of the stairs, Leander led her directly to the center of the ballroom. The orchestra struck up a waltz, the same waltz they had danced at the Blackmore ball, their first dance together, and he drew her into his arms. "Everyone is staring," she whispered. "Everyone should be. You're extraordinary." His hand was warm at her waist, his grip on her fingers sure and steady. "Don't think about them. Think about the music. Think about the steps. Think about you?" Something flickered in his storm-colored eyes. "If that helps." They danced, and for a moment, the watching crowd ceased to exist. There was only the music, sweeping and golden, and the warmth of his hands, and the strange, fierce joy of moving together in perfect synchronicity. She stopped counting steps. She stopped worrying about watching eyes. She simply let herself feel. When the waltz ended, Leander didn't immediately release her. His eyes held hers with an intensity that nearly stole her breath. "You're doing beautifully," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "Even my grandmother looks satisfied, which is practically unprecedented. Only because she's terrified I'll trip and embarrass the family name." "You couldn't embarrass anyone." His thumb brushed against her gloved fingers, so briefly she might have imagined it. "You could never embarrass me." Before she could respond, a sugary voice cut through the moment. "Your Grace, how delightful to see you finally taking an interest in someone." Lady Isolde Pemberton descended upon them in pale pink silk. She was beautiful, with hair like spun gold, but her smile never reached her eyes. "Lady Isolde," Leander's voice cooled. "How pleasant. And this must be the mysterious Miss Ashford." Isolde's gaze swept over Honoria. "What a lovely gown. So brave of you to wear ivory. It can be so unforgiving." "I find it flatters those with nothing to hide," Honoria replied evenly. "How clever. Tell me, how exactly did you capture our dear Duke's attention?" "My conversation, I believe. I'm told it's refreshingly direct." Isolde turned to Leander. "Save me a dance, Your Grace?" "I'm afraid my card is quite full this evening." Fury flashed across her features before she recovered and glided away. "Well done," Leander murmured. "You didn't flinch." "Should I have?" "Most people do. She has that effect." His hand found the small of her back, guiding her away from the dance floor. "Come, let me introduce you to some people who are actually worth knowing." The rest of the evening passed in a whirl of introductions and dances. Clemency appeared at regular intervals, whispering helpful context about each new acquaintance. The Dowager held court in a corner, her sharp eyes missing nothing. And Leander stayed near, not obviously, not in a way that would seem improper, but always within view, always aware of where she was and who she was speaking to. It felt like protection. It felt like something more. Then Venetia appeared. She materialized at Honoria's elbow, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. "Honoria, darling sister, I hardly recognized you in that gown. Madame Laurent has been very kind." "Has she? How fortunate." Venetia leaned closer. "Enjoy this while it lasts. Men like the Duke don't marry nobodies like you. They amuse themselves and move on. And when he does, I'll be waiting. We all will." She swept away before Honoria could respond, leaving her shaking with fury. "What did she say?" Leander appeared at her side. "You've gone pale." "Nothing of consequence," Honoria forced her voice steady. "Just sisterly concern." "That wasn't concern. That was cruelty." His jaw tightened. "I saw her face. What did she say?" "The truth, according to her." Honoria met his eyes. "That this is temporary. That you'll move on. That I'll be left with nothing but the memory of playing dress-up in a world I don't belong to." "She's wrong." The words came out fierce, almost angry. "You belong wherever you choose to stand, and she has no idea." He stopped himself, took a breath. "She has no idea of anything. Doesn't she?" Honoria's voice cracked slightly. "Because from where I'm standing, she's described this arrangement perfectly." Something shifted in his expression. Pain, or recognition, or something deeper. "We should talk," he said quietly. "Properly. But not here." "Then where?" "Tomorrow. The library. After breakfast." His hand brushed against hers, hidden by the folds of her gown. "Please." She nodded, not trusting her voice. And for the rest of the evening, she danced and smiled and performed, while her heart raced with questions she was afraid to answer. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in the Rose Suite's magnificent bed, staring at the canopy above her, replaying Venetia's words and Leander's response until both lost all meaning. By morning, she had talked herself in and out of hope a dozen times. The library meeting never happened. At breakfast, a letter arrived for Leander, and his expression went cold as he read it. He excused himself immediately, disappearing into his study with barely a word to anyone. A second letter arrived an hour later, then a third. Servants hurried through the corridors with grim faces. "What's happening?" Honoria asked Clemency, who looked worried for the first time since they'd met. "I don't know. Something about the estates in the north. There was a fire, one of the tenant farms, several people injured." She bit her lip. Leander will blame himself. He always does. The house fell into a tense quiet. The dowager emerged briefly to issue crisp orders to the staff, then retreated to her solar. Clemency paced the morning room, and Honoria waited in the library, surrounded by books she couldn't focus on, watching the door for someone who didn't come. It was nearly evening when Leander finally found her. He looked terrible, exhausted and gray, his cravat long since abandoned, his eyes haunted by whatever news he'd received. "I'm sorry," he said from the doorway. "I meant to come earlier. The fire, Clemency told me, is everyone. 2 children injured. They'll recover, but..." He ran a hand through his hair, destroying what remained of its order. "I should have been there. I should have inspected those buildings months ago. I knew the chimneys were old. I knew..." "You can't be everywhere." Honoria rose, moving toward him. "You can't prevent everything." "Can't I? I'm the Duke. Their welfare is my responsibility. Every decision I've delayed, every inspection I've postponed because I was too busy hiding in London, playing at courtship instead of doing my duty. This wasn't your fault. It feels like my fault." His voice cracked. "Everything feels like my fault lately." They stood there in the fading light, the distance between them charged with something neither of them quite knew how to name. Honoria understood suddenly why he had retreated from the world after Marguerite's betrayal. It wasn't just wounded pride. It was this terrible weight of responsibility, this fear that every choice he made might hurt someone, that caring about anything meant opening himself to devastating consequences. "Come with me," she said quietly. "You need air." She led him through the house to the conservatory, a glass-walled room she'd discovered during her restless wanderings, filled with orchids and trailing vines and the scent of growing things. The late sun streamed through the windows, turning everything golden. "I come here sometimes," she said, settling onto a wrought iron bench surrounded by ferns. "When everything feels too heavy. The plants don't care about society or scandals or duty. They just grow." Leander stood amid the greenery, looking lost in a way she'd never seen before. "My father used to bring me here," he said, "when I was young. He said this was where he came to remember that the world was larger than estate ledgers and parliamentary debates." He touched a leaf, gentle as a caress. "I haven't been here since he died." "Maybe that's why you needed to come back." He looked at her then, really looked, and whatever walls remained between them began to crumble. "I've been avoiding you," he said. "I noticed. I'm sorry. I don't..." He stopped, struggled, tried again. "After I gave you my mother's book, I realized I'd done something I hadn't done in 3 years. I'd let someone in. And letting people in means they can hurt you. It means I can hurt them." His voice was raw. "Everyone I care about, I disappoint. My father died while I was in Scotland. Marguerite, whatever her faults, I failed to see her clearly until it was too late. And now those children are burned because I couldn't be bothered to check a chimney. Leander." She rose, closing the distance between them. "You are not responsible for everything that goes wrong in the world. You're one man, carrying more weight than anyone should carry alone. And what if I break under it? What if I... He looked at her, and she saw fear in his eyes, real fear. What if I break and take you down with me? Then we break together. The words came out before she could stop them. That's what people do when they care about each other. They share the weight. The conservatory fell silent except for the distant sound of bird song and the whisper of leaves in some unfelt breeze. You make me want to be better, he said quietly. You make me want to be present instead of going through motions. You make me want... He stopped, his hands rising to cup her face with trembling fingers. You make me want... Leander, I know this was supposed to be an arrangement, a performance. I know we agreed on terms and conditions and an end date. But somewhere along the way... His forehead touched hers, and she could feel his breath warm against her lips. Somewhere along the way, I stopped pretending. Her heart hammered against her ribs. So did I. And then he kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate and searching. 3 years of loneliness and grief and fear pouring into a single moment. His hands tangled in her hair, scattering pins across the stone floor. Her fingers clutched his shirt, pulling him closer, 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 until she couldn't tell where she ended and he began. When they finally broke apart, both gasping for air, his eyes were wild with something that looked very much like hope. We need to talk about this, he said. About what this means. About, I know. Tonight, after dinner. I'll come to you, and we'll, I know. She smiled against his lips. But right now, can we just... He kissed her again. Softer this time. Sweeter. And the golden light of the conservatory wrapped around them like a blessing. For one perfect moment, everything felt possible. Everything shattered within a week. Lady Pemberton's garden party was legendary for 2 things: its elaborate refreshments and its vicious gossip. Attending was mandatory for anyone who wished to remain in society's good graces, which meant Honoria found herself walking through wrought iron gates into a garden designed to showcase wealth rather than beauty. The days since the conservatory had been perfect. Stolen moments in the library, meaningful glances across the dinner table, conversations that lasted until the small hours of the morning. Leander had begun to smile more, real smiles that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. Even the dowager had noticed, commenting with dry approval that her grandson finally looked somewhat human again. Honoria had begun to believe that this might actually work, that the arrangement might become something real, that she might actually get to keep this impossible, wonderful thing she had found. She should have known better. Stay close to me, the dowager instructed as they entered the party, her voice low. Lady Pemberton has been waiting for an opportunity to corner you without my protection. We won't give her one. But even the dowager couldn't protect her from everything. The party was in full swing when Honoria stepped away to find a retiring room, only to become hopelessly lost in the Pemberton mansion's labyrinthine corridors. She was trying to retrace her steps when voices drifted from an open doorway, familiar voices that made her freeze. Really think she has a chance with him? Lady Isolde's laugh was crystalline and cruel. She's a nobody with nothing to offer. Leander is simply using her to avoid his grandmother's pressure. Once he's secured his freedom, he'll discard her like yesterday's newspaper. But the dowager seems genuinely fond of her. Another voice, one Honoria didn't recognize. The dowager is playing her own game. She always is. She doesn't actually believe that Provincial Mouse is worthy of her grandson. She's simply using Miss Ashford to teach Leander a lesson about cooperation. Once he agrees to consider proper matches again, the mouse will be sent back to whatever hole she crawled from. And you'll be waiting. I'll be waiting. The satisfaction in Isolde's voice was palpable. I've already spoken to Leander's grandmother about resuming discussions. She was quite receptive. Apparently, she's realized that this little experiment has run its course. Honoria's blood turned to ice. The Dowager, receptive to Isolde? After everything? She forced herself to move, to walk away before she was discovered. But the words followed her like poison, seeping into every crack in her fragile confidence. She found her way back to the garden eventually, emerging onto a terrace that overlooked the party below. She needed air, needed space, needed... Honoria. Leander stood at the terrace's edge, concern written across his face. You disappeared. I was worried. I overheard something. Lady Isolde and someone else. They said... She pressed her hands against her eyes, fighting tears she refused to shed. They said your grandmother is resuming discussions with the Pembertons. They said I'm just a lesson you're both teaching yourselves, and when it's over, that's not true. He caught her hands, pulling them from her face. Look at me. Isolde lies. She manipulates and schemes and says whatever will cause the most damage. My grandmother is not resuming discussions with anyone. I asked her directly last week. You asked her? I asked her to stop, all of it. The matchmaking, the pressure, the endless suggestions. His grip on her hands tightened, his eyes fierce. I told her I wasn't interested in Lady Isolde or anyone like her. I told her the only person who had made me feel anything in 3 years was... He stopped, but not soon enough. Was who? She whispered. Was you. And he kissed her, right there on Lady Pemberton's terrace, in full view of anyone who might be watching. The kiss was everything, desperate and tender and real. When they broke apart, both breathless, Leander's forehead pressed against hers. I love you, he said, the words tumbling out like they'd been fighting to escape. I know it's too soon. I know we agreed to something else entirely, but I can't pretend anymore. I love you, and I don't care who knows it. Leander, you don't have to say it back. Not yet. Not until you're sure. But I needed you to know that this isn't an arrangement anymore. Not for me. Her heart soared. It's not an arrangement for me either. It stopped being an arrangement weeks ago. She smiled through tears she'd stopped fighting. I love you too. His answering smile was radiant, and then it froze, his gaze fixing on something over her shoulder. Honoria turned. Venetia stood in the terrace doorway, her expression triumphant. A cluster of society matrons gathered behind her, like an audience assembled for a show. Well, well, Venetia said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent terrace. How touching. Though I do wonder what everyone will say when they hear about my sister throwing herself at a duke in public. Hardly the behavior of a respectable young lady, wouldn't you agree? The matrons whispered and stared. Someone laughed, high and cruel, and Honoria felt her perfect moment crumble to ash. The scandal broke like a summer storm, swift, devastating, and impossible to outrun. Within hours, the Ton was buzzing with the story of how Miss Honoria Ashford had been caught in a compromising embrace with the Duke of Valemont. Venetia's version was the one that spread, a tale of a scheming nobody who had seduced her way into a duke's affections, a social climber with neither breeding nor shame, who had been discovered pursuing her prey in public. She was practically attacking him, Venetia told anyone who would listen, her voice dripping with false sympathy. It was mortifying. My poor mother is devastated to discover the depths of Honoria's deception. We had no idea she was capable of such brazen behavior. Their mother, far from being devastated, was furious, but not at Venetia's cruelty. She descended upon Ashworth House 2 days after the garden party, demanding entry to retrieve her wayward daughter. You've ruined everything, Lady Ashford hissed, cornering Honoria in the morning room while the butler went to fetch the dowager. Venetia was supposed to make a great match. Venetia was supposed to restore our family's fortunes. And now everyone is talking about you instead, and not in a way that helps anyone. Mother, you will return home immediately. You will issue an apology to Lady Pemberton for causing a scene at her party, and you will stay away from the Duke of Valemont if you have any sense left in that foolish head of yours. I'm not going anywhere. Honoria's voice shook but didn't break. The Dowager has clearly lost her faculties if she thinks you're suitable for anything but service. Lady Ashford's eyes blazed with a fury Honoria had never seen before. Not cold indifference, but hot, bitter rage. You are nothing, Honoria, nothing. And the sooner you accept that, the easier this will be for everyone. The words landed like physical blows, finding every bruise her mother's indifference had left over the years. But before Honoria could respond, the Dowager's voice cut through the room like steel. I believe, Lady Ashford, that you've said quite enough. She stood in the doorway, magnificent in silver silk, her eyes like chips of Arctic ice. Miss Ashford is my guest, she continued, her voice cold enough to freeze flame. And she will remain my guest for as long as she chooses. If you have objections to this arrangement, I suggest you direct them to me rather than berating a young woman who has done nothing except exist in spaces where you believe she has no right to be. Lady Ashford's face went white, then red. Your Grace, I meant no disrespect. And yet you have given a great deal of it. To your own daughter, no less. The Dowager's gaze was withering. You may see yourself out. And you may tell that other daughter of yours that if she continues spreading malicious gossip about a guest of mine, she will find society's doors closing rather quickly indeed. Lady Ashford fled, but the victory felt hollow, because that evening, while Honoria sat in the library, trying to process everything that had happened, she overheard a conversation that shattered what remained of her fragile hope. She had come to find a book, something to distract herself, something to quiet the chaos in her mind. But voices drifted from behind the partially open door of Leander's study, and her feet stopped moving without her permission. Can't continue like this, the Dowager's voice, sharp with frustration. The scandal is damaging not just Miss Ashford, but our entire family. Lady Pemberton is calling for her to be cut from all social events. 3 invitations have already been withdrawn. So we weather it, Leander's voice, tight with tension. We've weathered worse, have we? Your father's death, Marguerite's betrayal. Those were private wounds. This is public humiliation, and it's spreading. Every day the gossip continues, our position weakens. Then we fight back. How? By making the association official? A pause, heavy with implication. Is that what you want, Leander? To marry the girl? Because that's the only thing that will silence the rumors now. Silence. Long, terrible silence. I don't know, Leander finally said, and his voice was hollow. I don't know what I want. Everything has happened so fast, and I can't tell if what I feel is genuine, or if I've simply been swept along by circumstance. The words were a knife to Honoria's heart. Then perhaps it's best if Miss Ashford returns home for a while, the Dowager said, until you can determine your true feelings without the pressure of scandal and society watching your every move. Another silence. Then, quiet as a death knell. Perhaps you're right. Honoria didn't stay to hear more. She climbed the stairs to the rose suite on legs that felt made of lead. She pulled out her traveling case with hands that shook so badly she could barely grip the handle. She packed her few belongings, the borrowed dresses she would leave, the Ovid she couldn't bear to part with, and wrote 2 letters. One to Clemency, thanking her for her friendship. One to Leander, telling him not to look for her. Your Grace, I've overheard enough to understand the situation. You don't know what you want, and I can't wait while you decide. I am not a dress to be tried on and discarded if the fit isn't quite right. Thank you for showing me that I could be visible. I'll find a way to remain so without being a burden to your family. Please don't look for me. Honoria. She left before dawn, slipping out through the servants' entrance while the house still slept. Home felt smaller than she remembered, darker. The modest rooms that had once been merely cramped now felt like a prison, every corner reminding her of what she had almost had and lost. Her mother refused to speak to her. Venetia was triumphant. Her father's portrait watched from the wall, and Honoria imagined disappointment in his painted eyes, even though she knew she was being foolish. For 3 days, she existed in a haze of grief and numbness. She helped with the marketing. She mended her own clothes. She returned to being invisible, and the invisibility felt like dying slowly. On the 4th day, Clemency appeared at their door. "You absolute fool," she said, pushing past Honoria into the modest parlor before anyone could stop her. "You complete and utter fool. Do you have any idea what you've done? Clemency, he's been impossible since you left, worse than impossible. He's been terrifying." She paced the small room like a caged tiger, her yellow dress a shock of color against the faded furnishings. "He's fired 3 servants, shouted at grandmother. Shouted. Honoria, he never shouts. And he's refused to leave his study for anything except to demand that every investigator in London find out where you've gone. I left a letter. I told him not to look for me. Yes, and that made everything worse. He read it 17 times. I counted." Clemency grabbed her hands, her brown eyes fierce. "He loves you, you impossible woman. He's loved you for weeks. He just didn't know how to say it because he's a disaster at feelings, and the last time he loved someone, she destroyed him." Honoria's pulse hammered in her ears. "He told the Dowager he didn't know what was real. He told the Dowager he was scared. There's a difference." Clemency's expression softened. "I was listening too, you know, from the other side of the door, and what I heard was a man who's terrified of wanting something because wanting means it can be taken away. But wanting is different than not knowing. And the moment he realized you were gone, what? He broke." Clemency's voice gentled. "I've never seen him like that. Not even after Marguerite. He sat in the library holding your letter, and he just broke." Honoria sank onto the worn settee, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. "I can't go back just to be sent away again when—" "You won't be sent away. Grandmother has spent the last 3 days making very clear to London society that anyone who cuts you will answer to her personally. She's threatened to withdraw her support from at least 4 charitable organizations unless they defend your reputation. She's been magnificent, actually. Terrifying, but magnificent." "And Leander?" "Leander canceled the Pemberton contract." "What?" "The Pembertons hold a significant loan against some Ashworth properties. Lady Pemberton has been using it as leverage to push Isolde forward for years. Yesterday, Leander paid it off in full. The entire amount. He told Lady Pemberton that if her family ever spoke ill of you again, he would personally ensure they were ruined, socially and financially." Clemency grinned despite the seriousness of the moment. "It was extremely dramatic. I wish you could have seen it." Honoria pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "He sent me here with a message," Clemency continued, pulling a folded note from her reticule. "He says I'm to give you this and tell you that if you still want him after everything, he'll spend the rest of his life making sure you never doubt it again." Honoria took the note with trembling fingers. "Honoria, you asked me once what I felt when you were near. I answered badly. Let me try again. I feel like I've been living in a portrait, frozen and still, watching the world move without me. And then you appeared, and suddenly I remembered that I was supposed to be alive. You are not a dress to be tried on. You are the first real thing I've felt in 3 years, and I was a coward for not saying so when it mattered. Come back, please." not because of scandal or society or obligation. Come back because I love you, and I should have told you that before you left. If you don't come back, I'll understand. But I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I'd been brave enough to choose. Please choose me. I'm choosing you. Leander. Well, Clemency demanded. What do you say? Honoria looked up at her, at this fierce, wonderful girl who had become the sister Venetia never was. I say, she managed, through tears and something that might have been laughter, that I need to pack. Ashworth House looked the same, but everything felt different. Honoria stood in the entrance hall, her small case in hand, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the servants could hear it. Clemency had disappeared with suspicious speed, leaving her alone in the marble vastness. Footsteps echoed from the corridor. Then Leander appeared, and all the words Honoria had prepared vanished like morning mist. He looked terrible. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. His cravat was askew, his hair disheveled, his jacket wrinkled as if he'd slept in it, or more likely, hadn't slept at all. But when he saw her, his entire face transformed. Hope and fear, and something fierce and fragile blooming across his features all at once. You came. You asked me to. I wasn't sure you would. He moved closer, then stopped, as though afraid to touch her. Honoria, I need you to know. Everything I said to my grandmother, everything you heard, I was scared. Not uncertain. Scared. There's a difference, and I should have made it clear. So I've been told. She managed a watery smile. Clemency was quite emphatic. I should have been brave enough to say what I felt. I should have told you that night in the conservatory that I loved you, that I've been falling in love with you, since you called yourself a late-blooming flower and refused to flinch when I asked you to dance. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. I'm not good at this. I'm not good at feeling things, and I'm especially not good at saying them. But I'm trying, and I need you to know. I know. She closed the distance between them, taking his hands in hers. They were cold, trembling slightly. I read your letter. 17 times, apparently. Clemency told you that? She told me everything, including the part where you threatened to ruin the Pembertons. They deserved it. They did. She laughed, despite the tears still wet on her cheeks. But you didn't have to do that. Any of it. Yes, I did. His hands tightened on hers, his eyes blazing with conviction. Because you deserve someone who will fight for you. Not someone who hides in his study because feeling things is terrifying. Not someone who lets you believe, even for a moment, that you're not worth everything I have to give. Leander, I love you. Honoria, I love your wit and your courage, and the way you refuse to break no matter how many people try to bend you. I love that you read Ovid by firelight, and that you understand what it means to survive. I love that you came here as an arrangement, and somehow became the most important person in my world. His voice cracked on the last words. I love you, and I should have said it weeks ago. Her eyes filled with fresh tears. I love you too. I've been trying not to, because I thought this was temporary, because I thought I was a convenience rather than a choice. But I couldn't stop. You kept being kind when you didn't have to be, kept seeing me when everyone else looked through me. And I just... He kissed her before she could finish, pulling her against him with a desperation that spoke louder than any words could. She wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. I need to tell you something, he said, his voice rough. My grandmother is standing right here and can speak for herself. They stepped apart to find the dowager in the corridor entrance, her expression unreadable. Well, she said, surveying them both with those sharp, pale eyes. I see the prodigal has returned, and that my grandson has finally stopped being an idiot. Grandmother, quiet. I have things to say." She moved closer, and Honoria realized her severe expression held something almost like warmth. "Miss Ashford, I owe you an apology. The conversation you overheard was not what it seemed. I was testing my grandson, pushing him to see whether he would fight for you or let you go. I needed to know if what he felt was real." "You were testing him?" "I was testing you both, and you both failed initially, which was disappointing. But you've both recovered admirably, which is the important thing." She paused. "If you wish to marry this woman, Leander, you have my blessing, not my approval. I still think you're both fools who've made this far more complicated than necessary. But my blessing, yes." Leander looked at Honoria, his eyes bright with hope. "Then, Miss Honoria Ashford, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" She smiled through her tears. "I thought you'd never ask." He kissed her again, and somewhere in the depths of the house, Clemency's delighted shriek suggested she had been eavesdropping all along. The Thornwood Ball was the event of the season, and everyone knew why. The Duke of Valemont was going to make an announcement. The invitations had been accepted with feverish curiosity. Lady Pemberton and Lady Isolde were notably absent, having suddenly discovered urgent business on the continent. Lady Ashford and Venetia were present, though confined to the periphery by careful social maneuvering on the dowager's part. Honoria stood at the top of the grand staircase in a gown of deep emerald silk, the color Madame Laurent had always said suited her best. Her dark hair was arranged with the pearls that had belonged to Leander's mother, and when she looked in the mirror before leaving Ashworth House, she had finally seen what others apparently saw: someone who belonged. "Ready?" Leander murmured beside her, devastating in formal black, his eyes shining with love and pride. More than ready. They descended together, and the ballroom fell silent. Hundreds of eyes tracked their progress, curious, envious, and calculating. But Honoria no longer cared. She was exactly where she was meant to be. At the bottom of the stairs, Leander led her to the center of the floor. The musicians struck up a waltz, the same waltz they had danced at the Blackmore Ball, the night everything began, and he drew her into his arms. "Everyone is staring," she whispered. "Let them. They're witnessing history." The waltz ended, and Leander didn't release her. Instead, he raised his voice to carry across the silent ballroom. "6 weeks ago, I met a woman who called herself a late bloomer. She was standing alone at the edge of a ballroom, invisible to everyone except the sister who was determined to humiliate her. I watched that sister mock her in front of half the ton, and I watched this woman refuse to crumble." The crowd stirred, whispered, pressed closer. "I have spent 3 years hiding from life," Leander continued, his voice steady and sure. "Building walls, refusing to feel, convincing myself that control was the same as safety. This woman showed me that safety isn't living, that courage means choosing even when you're terrified, that love is worth every risk." He looked at Honoria, his eyes bright with emotion. "Miss Honoria Ashford has done me the honor of accepting my proposal of marriage. She did not pursue me. She did not scheme or manipulate. She simply existed with such courage and grace that I could not help but choose her. And I will spend the rest of my life grateful that she chose me in return." The ballroom erupted. Applause from most quarters, shocked silence from others, and from Clemency. A whoop of joy that was entirely inappropriate and absolutely perfect. Venetia, pale as milk, turned and fled the ballroom. Lady Ashford followed, her face a mask of disbelief. But Honoria didn't watch them go. She was too busy being kissed by a duke in front of half of London society. Scandalous, and perfect, and absolutely right. 6 months later, Honoria stood in the portrait gallery of Ashworth House, her house now, legally and completely, studying the painting of Leander's mother. "I told her about you," Leander said, appearing at her side and sliding his arms around her waist. "Before the wedding, I stood here and told her I'd found someone who understood transformation. Someone who read her Ovid and wept over her inscription. What do you think she would have said? I think she would have said that every ending is a beginning. He pressed a kiss to her temple. I think she would have loved you. I think I would have loved her too. In her pocket, Honoria carried something new, a letter she'd discovered that morning, tucked into the pages of the Ovid. It had slipped behind the binding, hidden for decades, and bore Marianne Ashworth's handwriting. To whoever finds this, if you're reading my words, then you've discovered my favorite hiding place for secret thoughts. I hope you're someone who understands that books hold more than just their printed pages. My son is growing fast, and I am growing slow. The doctors tell me things they think I cannot hear, but I hear everything. I know what's coming. So let me leave this for the future. Love is not a guarantee against sorrow. Love is what makes sorrow bearable. Choose love anyway. Choose it fiercely and completely, and without reservation, because a life without it is no life at all. Be brave. Be transformed. Become. Marianne Honoria had wept when she'd found it. Leander had wept when she'd shown him. And then they had sat together in the library, holding hands, reading his mother's words over and over until they knew them by heart. She knew, he said softly now. Somehow, she knew what we'd both need to hear. She knew her son. Honoria leaned back against his chest. She knew he'd need permission to choose happiness. They stood together in the fading afternoon light, surrounded by portraits and memories and the ghosts of love that had come before. Outside, London continued its endless dance of society and scandal. Venetia, humiliated by her failed schemes, had been forced to accept a modest match with a country vicar and had disappeared into rural obscurity. Lady Pemberton's social standing had never recovered from the Dowager's campaign against her. And Lady Isolde, it was rumored, had developed a sudden interest in a wealthy merchant's son with no title, but a great deal of money. The ultimate come-down for someone who had aspired to be a duchess. But inside Ashworth House, none of that mattered. Do you know what today is? Leander asked. The anniversary of our first dance. Close. He turned her to face him, hands warm on her shoulders. It's the anniversary of the night a wilted flower bloomed in my heart and never left. She laughed, tears pricking her eyes. That's terribly romantic for someone who claims to be bad at feelings. I've been practicing. He kissed her then, soft and sweet, and when they finally parted, he pulled something from his pocket. I had this made, he said, pressing a small velvet box into her hands. Open it. Inside, nestled on white silk, was a pendant in the shape of a flower. Not a rose, but something smaller, simpler. A late bloomer, rendered in gold and tiny emeralds, hanging from a delicate chain. For the woman who taught me that hardier flowers are worth the wait, he said. Honoria couldn't speak. She could only press herself into his arms and hold on. And every year, on the anniversary of their first dance, they returned to the Blackmore Ballroom. They waltzed in the exact spot where he had crossed the room to choose her, where she had called herself a wilted flower, where everything had begun. No one will choose you, Venetia had said. But someone had. Someone who saw her when she was invisible. Someone who crossed a ballroom for her when no one else would. Someone who loved her exactly as she was, and who had become exactly what she needed. And that, Honoria thought, as they danced beneath the candlelight, surrounded by whispers and stares, and the envious gazes of those who had dismissed her, that was the best transformation of all.